This video is brought to you together with CuriosityStream. For your special deal, use the link in the description below and the promo code MentorPilot. A Boeing 737-300 is on final descent in towards New Orleans International Airport in the United States. At around 16,000 feet, the crew inadvertently enter into a Category 4 thunderstorm. The turbulence is so immense that the crew can hardly read the instruments in front of them, and suddenly they run into about 30 seconds of heavy hail. The hailstorm is so intense that it flames out both number 1 and number 2 engine, and it leaves the aircraft without any power source. The crew is working feverishly to get at least one of the engines started, but initially to no avail. What is about to happen is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of aviation. It's the story of TACA Airlines Flight 110. Make sure you stay tuned for this one. The incredible story of TACA Airlines Flight 110 took place on the 24th of May 1988. The flight had originated in San Salvador, in El Salvador, and then the crew had flown over towards Belize City in Belize, and the incident happened on the second leg of the flight, the leg between Belize and New Orleans in the United States. The aircraft that they flew was a brand new Boeing 737-300 that had been delivered to TACA Airlines only a few weeks prior to the incident. On the incident flight, there were 38 passengers on board and 7 crew members. In the cockpit of the flight was Captain Carlos Dardanos. He is 29 years old, but he had managed to amass an impressive 13,410 hours on the day of the accident. Together with him was First Officer Dionisio Lopez. He was also very experienced at over 12,000 hours, and there was also a third crew member, a line training captain called Arturo Soleil. And the reason that he was there was not to do a line check on Carlos and Dionisio, but he was there to just verify the operation of this brand new aircraft. Because when a new aircraft variant is introduced into an existing fleet, it's very important to check how it's working and how the standard operating procedures and so on is working, right? So this makes perfect sense. Now, this was not the first day that this flight crew had flown this particular aircraft. In fact, they had been rostered to fly the exact same route the day before. But the day before, they had encountered a problem with the aircraft. When they landed after having flown from San Salvador to Belize, when they tried to start the engines again for their second flight over towards New Orleans, they just could not get the engines to start. They tried to start engine number 2, but no matter what they did, the engines would just not light up. So they shut down the aircraft, they had to cancel the flight for all the passengers, and they called in engineering. And engineering had a look at it, and what they found was that this aircraft, even though it was brand new, had been sitting out in the desert awaiting delivery for a while. And when it did so, it had drained the battery. And the battery didn't like that much, so the battery was not in good shape. So what engineering did was they just took away the old battery and replaced it with a brand new battery. And this is going to become a really important point in what's about to happen. The crew was really excited to fly this new aircraft because it had some really cool new features. It had an auto throttle, which they weren't used to using. It had nice lateral navigation, vertical navigation, and all these cool autopilot modes that they weren't used to having on the 737-200 that they normally flew. Anyway, on the incident date, the crew had prepared for the flight just like normal, and they were aware that they were flying into an area where they could encounter potential thunderstorms. But they took off normally from Belize City Airport. They climbed up to their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, and while they were up in cruise, the first officer asked Captain Carlos whether or not it would be possible for him to actually invite the passengers into the cockpit, just to show this 8th wonder of the world, which was the 737-300. Of course, this is back in 1988, so that was perfectly okay. They open up the door, they let the passengers come in, take photos, look at the cockpit, and it just goes to show how proud they were, and also shows the kind of spirit of the time, which I just love. Now, before we go any further, I just want to give you a little bit of details about one of the main characters of this story, which is Captain Carlos Dardanos. So if you want to look for a real seat of the pants, stick and rudder, proper South American pilot, Carlos would be him. Okay. He'd grown up flying. He came from a flying family, so he was flying from when he was a little kid. He got his licenses as early as he possibly could. He started flying commercially at a very young age. That's why he could amass 13,000 hours at the tender age of 29. But back in 1979, so 9 years prior to this incident, he'd been in a very serious incident where he was flying a small Piper Archer out close to San Salvador. After landing, he'd been caught in crossfires between the guerrilla and the normal El Salvador army, and a sniper had actually shot him. The bullet entered in the back of his cheek and went out through his left eye, leaving him completely blind on his left eye. Now you might ask yourself, how is that then possible that he is allowed to fly commercially with only one eye? And it wasn't easy, right? He had to go out and do what we call functional test flights. Because he was already flying commercially, they didn't want to take his livelihood away from him. So he had got the chance to go out and prove that he could still fly perfectly with only one eye. And after a period of about 3 months, they had actually allowed him to maintain his Class 1 medical, not only in El Salvador, which he was originally from, but also in the United States, because he was based in New Orleans at the time, so he needed the FAA to approve it as well. And they did, right? So he was flying on a special type of medical license at the time of the incident. Anyway, as the crew were now getting closer to their top of descent, they got the passengers out of the cockpit, they started to brief for the approach in towards New Orleans, and they also started seeing these thunderstorms appearing on the weather radar. Okay? Now, the weather radar on the 737-300 was state-of-the-art, really good weather radar. And the way a weather radar works generally is that you have a radar antenna that's situated in the nose cone, as in the very front of the aircraft, and that radar antenna will send out radar pulses. Okay? And the way it works is that the radar pulses will then bounce off things like precipitation, so rain, hail, snow, and the weather radar measures how much radar pulses is coming back in and how long it took for them to return. And based on that, it can form a picture of how much precipitation you have ahead of you and also how far away it is. And it shows that on our navigation displays. Okay? On the navigation display, you'll see a picture that's very similar to what you see when you watch the weather at the news on TV. So very light rain would be depicted as green. You get a little bit more rain or precipitation, it turns amber, and then the really bad heavy precipitation is red. Okay? Areas that are clear from any type of precipitation is generally black. So the aircraft now started to descend. It left 35,000 feet, and at about 30,000 feet they went into a covering cloud layer. Just prior to entering the clouds, they did what we always tend to do. They put the engine start switches to continuous. This means that instead of what we normally have during cruise, the start switches to off, which is when the kind of flame inside of the combustion chambers in the jet engines are just feeding itself. Well then, just out of an abundance of caution, we switch it to continuous, which means that the igniter inside of the jet engine continuously keeps igniting. That's to make sure, or safeguard against flame out as we get into potential icing conditions. So that's what they did. They put the start switches to continuous and they switched on the engine anti-ice for the same reason. But now, as they're descending in towards New Orleans, they see that there are at least 2 big thunderstorms ahead of them, right? They see these 2 red cells. So they get in contact with Houston Air Traffic Control and they ask them to divert towards the east to get around these thunderstorms. Houston Air Traffic Control gives them the clearance to do so. Basically, they say you can deviate on your own kind of reconnaissance and just tell us when you're turning back towards New Orleans. So that's what they did. They're looking at these thunderstorms and they see that in between the thunderstorms, there looks like there is a black area that they could safely navigate through and get back in towards New Orleans. Another thing that you have to understand about weather radars is that they're not perfect, okay? And just like with any type of obstacle, if you have a really heavy thunderstorm in front of you, well then a lot of these radar pulses that are being emitted is going to come back into the radar. That's what's giving you the kind of red radar return. But another function of that is that you will be unable to see what's behind this red cell. That's what we call a radar shadow. All right? And that happens behind mountains, for example, behind large buildings, or in this case, behind really severe thunderstorms. So this means that if you have, like they had in this case, two big thunderstorm cells and then an area of black that is in between and behind it, it might give you a false sense of security. But the only reason that you don't see anything behind these radar echoes is just because something called attenuation. All right? It's the weakening of the radar signal. So the crew now turns in between these two cells, and as soon as they get in between them, they realize their mistake. Okay? Turns out that behind these two initial cells, there's a much bigger red cell, and now they're completely surrounded. They have cells both on the left and the right, and they fly into this thunderstorm. As they do so, they almost immediately encounter moderate to severe turbulence. The turbulence is so bad that they reported that they could not see the instruments ahead of them. They had problems reading their instruments. Seconds later, they enter into some really heavy hail. Okay, 30 seconds of severe hail and heavy rain. It's expected that the rain was equivalent to about 30 inches per hour, or about 25 to 30 grams of water per square meter, just to give you some idea of how much water it is. And as they're entering this hailstorm now, both engines flame out. Now, you might ask yourself at this point, engines flaming out, how come they flame out? Aren't they tested to be able to ingest a lot of water? And you'd be absolutely right to ask that question. In fact, the engines, the CFM56 engines that were fitted to the 737-300, has been certified to take almost 4 times the amount of water that was expected that the engines were ingesting at the time, and still continue to operate. However, turns out that there has been a crucial omission when it comes to the testing and certification of these engines. Because the engineers that made this test, they assumed that water and hail would act in kind of the same way, right? So they never tested how this jet engine would actually perform if there was hail involved. And it turns out that while they were using basically fire hoses and shot straight into the engine during the testing and certification, the water would hit the fan blades and be centrifugated out towards the bypass duct and away from the core of the engine. But the hail didn't work that way. Instead, the hail worked more like a bullet. It followed a ballistic path. So while the water was centrifugated out, these hail pellets, they went in, and especially turns out at lower power settings, when the fan is not rotating at such a high speed, it could go in between the fan blades and enter straight into the compressor stage of the engine, and then basically saturate that stage into the combustion chamber and flame the engine out. So this is what happened on this flight, and it happened on both engines simultaneously. And when this happened, you have to understand that generally the aircraft takes all of its electric power from the 2 engine-driven generators, which is connected to the engines. So they're now in heavy, severe turbulence. Both engine flames out. This means that the cockpit essentially goes black, except for the multitude of warnings, master course warnings, that they are getting. The primary instrumentation in front of the pilot also disappear. And here is where I want you to pay close attention, because what Captain Carlos is doing now is something that we, all pilots, should learn from. He continues to fly the aircraft. Even though he is originally very, very disoriented, this heavy turbulence will very quickly, make you lose sight of what's up and down, especially as you don't have any visual references. He looks around this cockpit to see what he can trust. And on the 737-300, when it loses electrical power from the generator, it goes to its backup source, which is battery. Remember the battery that they had just changed the day before? The battery is built to drive some of the more critical systems. Okay, that means that they have the standby instruments, you have one radio, you have a few warnings that are still working, you have some emergency lighting for the cabin, and a few other systems. Okay, the 737 does not have a ram air turbine, because you still can fly the aircraft, as in the flight controls are connected by wires to its respective rudder surface. So you can use only battery power, and the battery fitted onto the 737-300 will last for about 30 minutes. So Captain Carlos is looking over, he sees his tiny little standby horizon, and he uses that, fixates on that, make sure that the aircraft keeps flying wings level and on speed, right? That's all he's doing at this point. And this goes to the crucial aviate, navigate, communicate that we always have to follow when we're flying aircraft. Right? And it's likely that if he would have been overcome by the turbulence, by the loss of both engines, at this point he could have ended up in a very bad attitude from which he potentially couldn't escape later on. But he continues to fly, and that's the important bit. Now, as he's doing this, he's now calling over to his colleagues and he's telling, I've lost trust on both engines. Initially, they don't even believe him, right? They think that he's joking, but he shows them by putting the thrust levers forward twice without getting any kind of response. So he tells them, try to fix it. Try to get one of the engines running. But at this point, the industry didn't think that it was possible for two engines to flame out at the same time, which meant that up until this point, there was no loss of thrust on both engines checklist, okay? So the first officer, together with the training captain on the jump seat, now had to try to start the engines from their basic knowledge of the aircraft and from the existing engine failure checklist. So they went about trying to do this, okay? Captain Carlos concentrating on flying the aircraft. His two colleagues are now trying to start the engines. And initially they tried to start it with something called a windmilling start. That's basically when you're using the speed of the aircraft, the air that is being pushed in by the speed of the aircraft, to rotate the engine part, both the fan and the compressors, to get the engine started. But it turns out it just doesn't work, right? There's just too much water inside of the engine. It's possible that the speed wasn't high enough. Generally, you need more than 300 knots in order to be able to do this. So they realized they need something else. Right? They need the auxiliary power units, the APU, the little engine that's in the back of the aircraft. So this is happening at about 16,000 feet. And as they descend through about 12,000 feet, they reach over and they start the APU. The APU starts up. When they have that up and running, it means that they now get full electrical power restored, so they get their primary instrumentations back, they get their radios back. So at this point, they also have a possibility to call air traffic control with a mayday call, telling them that they have lost all power. Air traffic control is extremely helpful. Okay, they start to give potential vectors towards a landable spot. That includes several lakes in the area. It includes an interstate highway as an airfield that's a little bit closer than New Orleans International Airport. But Captain Carlos quickly realizes that with the kind of turbulence, just remember they're still inside of the thunderstorm here, they're losing altitude very quickly and they won't be able to reach any of those. His colleagues are now working to try to use the APU to start the engines up. And they manage, actually, to get both engine number 1 and engine number 2 started up, as in the EGT starting to rise. The problem though is it turns out that the engines are too saturated with water. So even though they have the engines lighting up, they cannot get them to function properly. Instead, as Captain Carlos is now asking the engines for thrust, what happens is that the engines immediately overheat, right? The exhaust gas temperature becomes too high and it actually melts some parts of the turbines in the engines, causing damage to the engines. He gets overheat warning. I think that they also got a fire warning shortly, so they realized that, okay, these engines are not working, and they shut them down. So now they know, right? They are not going to have any engines. They are going to continue to fly this aircraft and land it wherever they can. Captain Carlos has now called the cabin crew as well. They told them to prepare for a potential ditching, definitely for an emergency landing. So the cabin crew is preparing the passengers for this. As the aircraft is now descending out through about 5,000 feet, the crew starts to see the ground below them. And in an interview, which by the way I've linked to up here, you have to watch this interview if you're interested in getting more details about this incident, Captain Carlos says that he could kind of see this perfectly runway-shaped canal that is on the eastern outskirts of New Orleans. He realized that it's at 5,000 feet, it's about 15 miles away, which is perfect gliding distance from the 737, and he lines the aircraft up to ditch in this canal. Right. So, as they're descending down now, the first officer is running through the ditching checklist. Okay? The ditching checklist includes things like, for example, closing the outflow valve, preparing the cabin crew, pulling certain circuit breakers and deactivating the GPWS warning, things like that. As the aircraft is coming in and lining up for the ditching, the first officer is looking out on his side and he realized that on the side of the canal there is something called a levee. All right, there's basically a grass-covered area, not as wide as the canal, but wide enough to land on with just a slight inclination. Okay, so the first officer pointed out to the captain and said, "Captain, we can land over there." Captain Carlos looks out, realizes that, yeah, okay, that is a good landing spot, but also realizes that he is a little bit high. So while he had prepared for the ditching, he prepared to go in without much flaps and with the gear up, because that's how you would go into ditching. He now asks immediately to take the gear down. Okay, to get the flaps out, he reaches for his speed brakes, pull the speed brake out, and he also does something that you just don't hear people do on commercial airliners. He does what we call a side slip, right? That is when you push rudder and opposite aileron in order to essentially push the aircraft body into the airstream and make the whole body work as an air brake. This is a very efficient way to lose altitude, something that you would use on smaller aircraft or on gliders to get down, but not on airliners. Because if you do that, you can actually induce an engine failure on one side because of the vortexes that comes off the body and into the engine. But of course, these guys, they don't have any engine, so that's not really a risk that he's taking. So he slide slips into position. He sees that on the very kind of near end of this levee, there is a fence. So he just eases over that fence, comes in, and makes a perfect, smooth butter landing on this leeway. Okay. Remember, they don't have any thrust reversers, so he has to use brakes. He cannot use too much brakes because he doesn't know how soft the ground is, but he managed to roll out and bring the aircraft to a complete stop. The aircraft is safe. The passengers are safe, and there's not even any damage except for the damage that's already been caused to the engines. This is an amazing story. Okay, they sit for a while, look at each other, give each other a hug, and then realize that we should probably evacuate. There actually was a discussion in the cockpit whether or not they should evacuate because the aircraft is safe, but then again, you don't really know if, for example, the landing gear is safe or not. So they decide to evacuate the aircraft, they call for the evacuation, everyone gets off the aircraft, and then the thunderstorm that they just flown through comes in and it starts raining heavily outside. Now outside, everyone is calling for the pilots to come out. Come out, jump out. And Captain Carlos and his flight crew just looks at them and said, no, it's raining. So they actually sit inside of the aircraft until it stops raining. And then they go out and join the passengers outside. Now, you would think that this would be the end of the story, okay, but this story actually becomes even more crazy. And if you stay to just after this break, I'm going to tell you how they managed to get the aircraft out of this levee. This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. And CuriosityStream is one of those things that I just know that you guys like. Because in all fairness, you're watching this episode, which is kind of like a documentary. And documentaries is exactly what CuriosityStream is all about. They have thousands of high-quality documentaries and non-fictional series from some of the best filmmakers in the world, and quite a lot of exclusive material as well. A series that I am following at the moment is a series called Heavy Lift, and right now I'm watching an episode about the Antonov 225, which I just know that you guys would love watching as well. And if you think that this is interesting, well then go down, click the link in the description of the video, which is curiositystream.com/mentorpilot, and use the promo code mentorpilot, all small letters. That will give you a full 30 days trial period with CuriosityStream, and if you think that this is something for you, well then it's quite cheap actually to sign up. It's $2.99 per month, or if you want to go yearly, it's $19.99. So go down, click the link, and enjoy. After landing, the representatives of TACA Airlines had a bit of a quandary. How are they going to get this aircraft away from this levee? Initially, they thought that the best way to do it was probably to just demount the wings and put the whole aircraft on a barge together with the wings, and then get it to a place where it could be reassembled and reused again. But then someone pointed out that the levee that they had landed on was next to the NASA Mashoud assembly facility, which used to, during World War II, be an assembly factory for making, among other things, aircraft. And when you have an assembly line for aircraft, it's handy if you have an airport as well. So it turns out that the road that was just in front of this NASA facility used to be an old World War II runway that had now been turned into something called the Saturn Boulevard. So what they did instead was they waited until the ground had dried up a little bit so it could kind of support the wheels of the aircraft, and then they towed the aircraft to the beginning of this road. Then they got FAA clearance. FAA went out, made sure that obstacle clearance and so was okay. Then they loaded up the aircraft with the minimum amount of fuel needed, and then a couple of test pilots, not the same crew as did the flight, used this road and took off, right? They took off from this piece of road and then flew over to land at New Orleans airport, which is where they were supposed to go, only 13 days late. So that's how they solved this. This aircraft was in such good shape after this landing that the only thing they needed to do was change the engines, basically, that had been damaged during the hailstorm. And once they had the engines on, the aircraft was completely airworthy, so they could do this flight, which is amazing. Anyway, obviously there were some upgrades needed to the CFM56 engines. After this incident, CFM went in and they looked very, very closely onto the certification requirements, and they realized that they needed to, for one thing, upgrade the spinner. The spinner before this incident was conical, and then what they did was they shaped it into a mix between a conical and an elliptical shape. So it's now called a conelliptical shape instead. That's the kind of spinners that you see on modern 737s. The reason they wanted to do that was because they found out that if hail hits that shape, it will deflect the hail outwards, and thus protecting the core of the engine inside. They also changed a little bit the distance and the number of fan blades on the engine, and they incorporated more variable bleed valve doors inside of the core of the engine, so that during low RPMs, during low power settings, these bleed valve doors could open and let any water that had been ingested into the core out before it reached into the combustion chamber. So there was some major upgrades made to the engine in itself. But on top of that, there was also some operational guidance given to the pilots. So for a while, if the pilots realized that they were going to go through moderate to heavy precipitation, they couldn't bring the engine back to idle. They had to stay at a slightly higher power setting to avoid this from happening. So once again, guys, as you can see, this is a very serious incident, this time handled masterfully by the crew. They helped each other out, they were CRM, they flew the aircraft, which is really, really important. And after that, the authorities went in and saw what can we improve, how can we make flying safer, and it then became safer after it. Okay, so this was a really fun episode to do. Okay, since no one was hurt, this wasn't actually categorized as an accident, which meant that there was no final report. So I've had to go in and I've had to look at documentaries and I've had to read online descriptions and paper clippings and stuff about this incident, and I love doing that. Like I said, check out the interview with Captain Carlos about this incident. It's really, really good. If you like these kind of videos where I kind of break down famous incidents and accidents and explain them to you, well, then I hope that you have subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the little notification bell. I also hope to see you inside of my Discord server, right? We're almost 5,000 people in there now, and this Friday we're going to do a group flight in Greece. You can go and you can download my Mentor Pilot livery for free on mentorpilot.com, and then go into Discord and take part in this group flight. It's really, really fun. We did it a few weeks ago as well, and there are some really amazing pictures from that group flight. Anyway, I hope that you're doing absolutely fantastic, that you have a great day, and I see you next time. Bye-bye.